So I got 4 people on. Is that what I should have?
So all you're probably seeing is my clock says noon, and we are all about starting on time here. Welcome back to another edition of Minnesota Farm Bureau's Shop Talk. This has been a very informative series, and we've still got a couple yet to come, and we are very excited for the topic this week. We're going to start here today with a special guest who has I guess most people are probably familiar with the role that Chairman Colin Peterson has played throughout being an advocate for agriculture throughout the state of Minnesota and across the country. But we are very excited to welcome him here. He represents one of the largest district within the state of Minnesota and a variety of agricultural commodities. And he's been on the forefront of a lot of issues within agriculture, particularly as we've gone through some of this COVID response and the pandemic and how it has impacted farmers and ranchers throughout the state, throughout the country, and then also trickled down into the food supply. So first of all, let's welcome Chairman Colin Peterson. And Chair, we're just looking for some updates as to what's happening in Washington, D.C. and what you can share with our members today about agricultural policy and other things that are happening up on the Hill.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be with you, and thank Farm Bureau for being such a great group to work with. You guys have been great allies on many issues, and I've been pleased to work with your national chairman Zippy and your state chairman Kevin and others over the years, and that's been very helpful for me as chairman of the committee to have the Farm Bureau there to help me try to sort through some of this stuff. In terms of what's happening right now, we're out of session. We're, I guess, sort of. I'm not sure if we're really officially out, but I don't think we're going back until sometime in September. And the talks, there was a forum this morning, the talks are pretty much at a standstill. Mark Meadows announced yesterday, and we heard at our staff level that he doesn't think that anything is going to happen with this next bill until after September. So I'm not sure where that is all at. I'm not sure that's a bad thing necessarily, because I'm one of those that's a little bit nervous about how much money we're spending and how we're going to pay this stuff back, and there are certainly areas that have needs now, and I'd like to see it addressed, but there's other things I think that, would be nice that are not absolutely critical at this point. So in the so-called HEROES Act that passed the House, I was able to put a provision in there for agriculture, which got pretty broad support all through agriculture community. Addressed some of the major issues that I felt were there. We didn't spend a huge amount of money, but we focused on, I think, with three of the main areas, and that is what happened with the meat industry, with the hogs and turkeys especially, and somewhat cattle, where those plants were shut down and we had farmers that had to depopulate, and it's caused a lot of trouble and cost them a lot of money. And so one of the main things that I have in the bill, it gives the Secretary of Agriculture the authority to go in and help recover the cost of the depopulation of these animals and birds, which we did, in 2015 when we had avian influenza in Minnesota. That was done because the Secretary had the authority. The Secretary now claims he does not have the authority, and so this bill would give him that authority, would say that he can go retroactive in terms of helping these producers with depopulation, and also helping them get back into business if that's what they need to get going with low interest loans or whatever. I think that's one of the most crucial things that's in there. The second thing is ethanol. We have a serious crisis with ethanol plants, and there's a $2.3 billion in there for payments to the ethanol industry at 45 cents a gallon. during a base period from January to April. And if the plant was shut down, they could use the base period from the year earlier. So that's something I think that's really needed. And I'm very concerned about these plants staying viable and being able to stay in business going forward, because not only for the ethanol business, but also for the prices in general. I mean, these corn prices are in the tank because of the lack of demand in ethanol. That's one of the main problems. And these waivers that have been handed out by the administration, I think, are unwarranted. And, I've been going back and forth with them in terms of explaining to me why it is they gave out these waivers and, what the rationale was. And I've still not found any information. They haven't given me any information about why they did this. Now they're trying to give retroactive waivers all the way back to 2011. So that's another issue that's it's a big problem out there. We have corn below $3 in my district, partly, not all because of ethanol, but largely because of ethanol situation. So we're trying to keep those plants going and, hoping that oil prices will come back and we get back to normal and people get driving and so forth. So that's in the bill. Those are two things that I think are critical short term, and I'd like to see addressed. There's also money in there for some more direct payments. I don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but it's a pretty good package for agriculture, and something like that I think will end up in whatever final bill we end up putting together. I didn't want to vote for the bill in the House because it was, in my opinion, it was too expensive. I think $3 trillion was too much money. But at the end of the day, I went back and forth and argued quite a bit with the speaker. And she says, well, you should thank me because it started off at $6.5 trillion and I got it down to $3 trillion. At the end of the day, she put my ag stuff in without any questions. And so because of that, I supported the bill. So at the end, when this all gets resolved with the Senate, it's not going to be $3 trillion. It's going to be somewhere between $1 and $1.5 trillion. It's still a lot of money. We still have to pay it back. So that whole drama is going on. I guess right now in the committee, the main thing we're working on, and I've been having discussions with people around the country in terms of what happened with this pandemic and what we can do in the future to make sure we don't get into this situation again. And so we've had plans put together in USDA that have outlined what to do with African swine fever, foot and mouth disease, and so forth. But that wasn't actually put into. It was just a piece of paper laying on the shelf, and some people in the agency that worked on it. What I want to do, and what I've been working with the department, is to get a plan in place for avian influenza, or for African swine fever, for foot and mouth, for any future health pandemics like we had here with this COVID situation, so that we have a plan on the shelf. So we get into this situation again, the rules are written. It's made it clear that the money can come out of USDA's CCC fund, and we don't have to be worried about any appropriation bills or any disaster bills or any special bills being passed. That the Secretary has the authority to do what's need to be done to make sure that we can keep the supply chain and agriculture going, and we can keep feeding the world, like we've been doing. So we're working on that. We're just at the beginning of that process. We're working with a lot of the stakeholders on it. And that's going to be a major effort of the committee going forward. We've got other issues out there that are being brought up by different folks. We've got the storm that went across to Iowa. We now have a hurricane in the south. So we're looking at those, but until the crop insurance claims are kind of sorted through, it's not clear exactly what what the demand is going to be. We have to see what was covered by crop insurance and so forth. So anyway, we've been staying business, staying busy, doing a lot of Zoom meetings, doing a lot of things virtually, which I don't really like very much, but there's no other way to do it. And we're keeping busy. So we appreciate the chance to be with you today. I look forward to any questions you might have or advice you might have for us, things that you think we should be working on. We're happy to hear from you. So thanks very much and appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And we've got a couple of questions that have popped up. But again, if any viewers want to utilize the Q&A feature at the bottom, submit any questions that you have for Chair Peterson, that would be excellent. So as you kind of talked through some of the dynamics of, let's call it a very politically charged climate out in DC, where it does seem like it can be challenging to make sure your voice is heard. Do you have any advice for Farm Bureau members, how they can stay engaged, how they can stay not only active with, communication with their elected officials, but also just amidst this COVID situation, how they can be more vocal and making sure that their voice is heard on these issues?
Well, I would say the first thing everybody should do is turn off their television sets and quit watching cable news. Because in my opinion, a lot of the division that's being sold in this country is being sold by some of these cable news channels. And it's, honest to God, you watch one and you watch the other, it's like we live in a totally different country. And that is not helpful. So we've, the Ag Committee, we've largely avoided this. And it's because of the way we operate. No other committee, I don't think, operates the way we do. But if we have an issue, the first thing we do is talk to the Republicans. And we kind of talk through what they can live with, what we can live with, and try to figure out a plan to get forward, get to where we need to be to do what we need to address. But I think all of you have a relationship with your local legislators, your local congresspeople, your senators, and just communicate with them directly if you can. If it has to be virtually, if they happen to be in the area or whatever, and try to keep this stuff from becoming partisan. It shouldn't be partisan, especially in this COVID situation. We can't afford to be fighting with each other, especially in agriculture. We've got to work together as a group to make sure that we're focused on the right things and we don't get into partisan gridlock. And so I'm spent a lot of my time making sure we don't get into that. There's a lot of people trying to pull us in that direction, but if you can help us with that, the message to be these elected officials is let's work together, let's figure out what's best for the country, and let's figure out how to get it done.
Well, thank you for that. We did get another question on Facebook, which I think we're all maybe begging to ask this, and I don't know how much or what you'd be willing to share, but do you have kind of a realistic timeline in your mind, or that you've heard rumors of, as to what the HEROES Act passage timeline may be? I know you mentioned it probably won't get brought up again until you're back in mid-September, but anything we can maybe look forward to there?
Well, there is some, from what I can tell, there is some behind the scenes negotiation going on, or there's some talks going on. Because we have been asked at the committee to provide alternatives, scaled back alternatives to what we put in the HEROES Act. So that tells me there is something going on. So right now, the Senate has got what they call a skinny bill that's just very limited in what they're producing. The House wants a much broader bill, and that's where the thing is stuck right now. The question is, I think, how much political pressure is put on people, the next month is going to determine how soon this moves, because I think the only thing that's going to move this bill is when people feel the pressure of the constituents to get something done, and I have some questions like our side, they're pushing $600 unemployment benefits. I think I'm against that. $600 a week is more than most of my people make. and I'm for having maybe some additional unemployment benefits going forward, but I think it has to be scaled back and it has to fit the area. And this $600 came out of who was in the room at the time they did it. And in the room was Mnuchin from New York, Schumer from New York, McCarthy from California, Pelosi from California, and McConnell didn't seem to be much engaged. So what happened is you had people from New York and California. When I complained to them, Mnuchin says, well, that's $600 a week, that's chicken feed, he says. And I said, well, that's more than a take-home pay for a lot of people in my district, and this is a big problem. So I think that needs to be compromised out. I'm not so sure about making more checks to everybody of $1,200 a piece. I mean, I don't know how many people have come up to me and said, "Why did you send me a check? I don't need a check." So we just have to be careful about how we do this. But I'm hoping that I think what's gonna probably happen here, we're gonna need some kind of a CR. We've done our appropriation bills. The Senate hasn't. So September 30th, there's gonna have to be some kind of a bill passed to keep the government running. And that's probably where this is gonna get resolved. Towards the end of September, if it doesn't get resolved by then, what might happen is we might have a short-term 1-week CR and then try to figure something out. So I'm guessing later in September, first part of October, this will get resolved. And it might get all folded into some great big CR appropriation bill situation. And we're just making sure that we're at the table and we get the most important things for agriculture in the bill when it finally comes together. So that's kind of what I'm doing, and keep my ear to the ground, trying to keep all my fences mended with everybody so I don't make somebody mad and cause me to lose steading of whatever's going on, and that's what I'm doing. So,
Well, thanks for your candidness on that. I think, let me just double check here. So a question came in, and we might just have time for this one more question, but alfalfa is the third largest crop in the country. How come it wasn't included in recent ag assistance programs?
well, you tell me. I have talked to the secretary about this personally. I've talked to his people personally. We've talked to Johansson. We have sent letters. And yesterday I went public and sent a letter to the secretary questioning him on why it is he left some of these crops out, like alfalfa, like barley. There's a number of crops that it's inexplicable how they could not think that these crops had not been damaged. Their excuse is, well, we don't have enough price data to be able to do this. Well, some of the crops that they included don't have any more price data than alfalfa does, or some of these other small crops. So it is a mystery to me. And the reason I went public with this, what I normally don't do, is because we just weren't getting any place. And I had to, show the public that there's somebody out there fighting for them. They've still got half of the CFAP money left. So there's still $8 billion left. And now they're talking about doing another round of payments out of that CFAP money. And what I'm trying to do is keep the pressure on them so that if they do another round, it's more fair. And everybody is treated somewhat equally. I mean, they took periods of time that they based it on that were not realistic with the crop. They just did a bunch of things that didn't make any sense. And I tried to engage Johansson when he was doing this. And I tried to engage the secretary. They didn't want to talk to me. They went over and did their thing, and they didn't talk to anybody else. And this is what they came out with. And I told the secretary as soon as we saw it, I said, this is a problem. So I don't know what else I can do. I mean, I've weighed in as much as I know how, but I just think they made a lot of mistakes on this. And hopefully, with this money they have left over, they'll correct some of those mistakes. And if they're going to do something in the future, it would be more fair. Now, in the bill, the HEROES bill, there's $16 billion in direct payments. And in that bill, it directs the secretary to make the payments to all of these crops irrespective of all of their excuses. So if that gets true, then the secretary, I think, is going to have to do it whether he wants to do it or not because of the language that we put into the bill. So we're doing what we can, but you'd have to ask the secretary why he did this because it doesn't make sense to me.
Well, thank you for being a champion of that topic. And alfalfa is obviously a very important crop in the state. I probably only have like 2 minutes left for you, but one that I know other people are probably wondering is any update on the farm bill? That would be something we'd normally probably be talking about more if we weren't in the
Yeah,
pandemic.
I think the farm bill, anything we're going to do is on hold for the time being until next session. As I said, this whole supply chain issue is going to be on the burner before we get to that, and God forbid we get, we're going to get African swine fever. I don't think it's a question of if, it's a question of when, and we're really not ready. We weren't ready for this pandemic. So we have two different issues. We have one is a supply chain issue that has to do with the actual livestock themselves, and then we have an issue that has to do with the public, with the people, with the health of Americans. And they're two different situations. And we weren't ready for this pandemic that had to do with the health of people. And this is an area where we're going to have to engage folks that we have not engaged before, like the health departments in these states, and the unions in these packing plants and the food inspectors that are on the line and those kinds of things are, we're delving into that, and we're trying to get everybody at the table and get people to work together, to come up with the best solution that we can going forward. For example, when this last thing happened, I called JBS and I called Smithfield. And I said, we've got to get those plants operating. I said, if you can't operate them to harvest, then you have to operate those plants to help us kill animals. So because we have to figure out a way to depopulate, we just don't have a place to put them. So JBS was great. They got on this right away. Within 2 days, we had a plant in Worthington, and we started using that plant to kill animals, and we started hauling them out to rendering plants. And, Smithfield, I still have not heard back from them to this day. Now, I don't know if that's because they're Chinese owned or what, but anyway, we have to have a plan going forward. And we've all got to work together. And so I would just say JBS was great. The food and commercial guy from Minneapolis that was the workers representative was great, and we all worked together. We made it happen. And we have to have a process where we can do that with all of the packing plants because we have too much consolidation. We don't have, we've tried to get help to get more plants started and so forth, but it doesn't seem like Americans want to own these plants. Only foreigners want to own these plants, which is a problem in and of itself. So that's going to be what is front and center of getting that kind of resolved, bringing people to the table we haven't normally dealt with, and trying to come up with the answers so we don't get into this situation going forward. That's my main concern right now.
Well, thank you so much. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. We've done a lot of great work with secure food supply systems, but we hadn't necessarily always thought about the human health component of that and the whole supply chain and how that can all be impacted with a pandemic such as COVID. Well, thank you so much for your time, Chairman Peterson.
And if I could, Karen, I just want to thank the Farm Bureau for their endorsement. It's very much appreciated. And I look forward to working with you guys, hopefully in the next session, and we can get a lot of this stuff resolved. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll see you guys.
All right. Well, keep submitting any questions. We are excited to announce the rest of our presentation will be coming to us from Michael Nephew. Is that how you pronounce it, Michael? He is an American Farm Bureau economist. And as Congressman Peterson had pointed out, we obviously had experienced some livestock market challenges over the last couple months, and some of these things have kind of figured themselves out and other things haven't. So kind of getting some updates as to what that situation is currently and some things that American Farm Bureau is working on to understand that issue a little bit more broadly. And throughout the presentation, again, feel free to comment in the Q&A section, and then make sure we leave time at the end for questions. Take it over, Michael.
All right, thank you very much for having me, and I also say that you did get the pronunciation right, so also don't worry if you do mispronounce it, it's not going to offend me. I know it's a pretty complicated last name. But like you said, my name is Michael Nephew. I work for AFBF as primarily as our livestock economist. So to put that nicely, the last 5 months have been pretty busy for me. As soon as the pandemic hit, we saw the impact occur at the grocery store level, and then a month and a half later, you saw the resulting impact down at the processing level. And I think it's important when we talk about this to really kind of view these as two separate events that occurred within the supply chain. So you have more of a demand event, which is what we saw back in late March or so, about the time everything went into lockdown and you saw the grocery stores with empty meat cases and shelves. You couldn't get toilet paper or paper towels. When we're talking about the food supply chain, at that point, there was no actual shortage of food in this country. It was a supply chain temporary hiccup in trying to adequately get the food to where it needed to be in response to consumers stocking up their freezers. Now, fast forward a month or so, end of April, and especially that first week of May, we really see the impact, what I call more of a supply event. And that's the labor issues at the processing plants that we saw impacting legitimately the availability of meat and poultry within stores around the country. Now, again, I think it's very important to mention that we were not in a case of necessarily a meat shortage then either, but we were getting closer to the risk of it occurring. And there were cases where, again, not that people would not have something available at the stores, but there were limited supplies of certain proteins, especially certain cuts. I think the best way to describe it is you got to be flexible when you go to the store and your ability to change what you plan to cook based on what you can actually find. So I think it's important to break those out into two separate events. So first, I'd like to talk about the demand event. And one of the impacts that this really drives home for us is it came from the way we as Americans in this country consume food. So if you think about the dollars that you spend, and let's just say in this case, I'm talking about food dollars, really since about early 2015, the majority of the food dollars that Americans would spend were not spent on food that you consume within your house. The majority of your dollars were going to food away from home. Think of that as food service restaurants is the biggest section, both dine-in restaurants as well as fast food style restaurants, takeaway. In addition to that, there's also hotels, schools, your school lunch program, universities that are open, baseball games. People do spend a lot of money elsewhere. And when we saw the end of March, early April, the shutdowns take place around the country, you can see that impact in that blue line. It dropped magnificently, ridiculously low. And then we did not see a one-to-one ratio increase in what we were spending at grocery stores. I know early on a lot of people thought, people would just shift their dollars. Well, there's a lot of value add that goes into that food away from home stuff. If you think about eating a hamburger in your house versus eating a hamburger at a restaurant, you're going to spend more on that restaurant hamburger than you would on all the ingredients to make it at home. So it was not exactly an equal shift over into grocery stores. There's also a lot of supply chain challenges at the front end, and that it's not like you can just flip a switch and then move all the meat that was going into the restaurant sector over into the retail sector. A lot of times that's not really the case. So you think about it, there are some facilities processing perfectly proportioned steaks for this specific this specific restaurant going through the system. There's also something as simple as labeling requirements. If you're buying it in a grocery store, there are certain federally required requirements that FDA and USDA did their best to adjust in the middle of the pandemic, but that also impacted the ability to shift some of that over. Some of it is also just as simple as package sizes and what you're producing. When you're sending, let's use shredded mozzarella as an example, to a pizza shop, you're sending it in giant bags that are way above what any consumer would normally buy. So instead of an 8-ounce bag of shredded mozzarella, you're getting it in multiple pounds in a big bag being sent over. So again, it's not like you can just flip a switch and move everything over. So all really considered, our supply chain proved to be fairly resilient. Of course, when we talk about the meat side of things, and I'll get into that, it's much more complicated. But overall, we managed to get through that first part of the pandemic without severe widespread shortages of food in the country, which I think tells back to our food supply chain is more resilient than many of the people were worried about at the beginning. So talking about the slaughter numbers, and this goes back to the supply of it. Again, I think about them as two separate events. The supply numbers, sorry, were largely recovered by this point, but it was, the worst of it was really early May. That first week of May is when we saw the lows in both cattle and hog slaughter. Poultry was also impacted. I know turkey matters over there, but looking at, let's say, broiler slaughter numbers, they did decline. Not to the same extent as cattle and hogs, and then poultry also hasn't fully recovered to the same extent that cattle and hogs mostly has. I'll point out that this recovery did happen quicker than most people were anticipating. Most people were forecasting a bit slower of a recovery in the slaughter. This again was not a demand issue, it was a supply issue, and most of this derived from labor issues at the plants. You had workers who were unable to go into work either because they were getting sick, they were concerned about getting sick, people had kids at home, they didn't want to potentially get sick at work and bring it into elderly family members at home. So there were a lot of legitimate concerns about workers going in. Additionally, I'd like to point out that this isn't just the result of plants shutting down. So a single plant shuts down, you know what the impact is. The bigger impact, in my opinion, was all the plants that remained open were operating at severely reduced capacity. So if you have all the other plants operating at 70 or 60% of capacity, that really helped drive that slaughter number down to where we saw it go. So it took them a while to adjust. Part of that was coming up with PPE plans, trying to put in plexiglass barriers in between workers in the plants. But again, the fact that they were able to recover as quickly as they did was somewhat of a surprise to many in the industry. And I'll pay specific attention to the fact that cattle slaughter is still operating a bit below where we were last year or so, well below where we were earlier in the year, where we were above year-ago levels, but we're in that 95-ish% capacity, plus or minus, given the day or the week. So again, for the most part, largely recovered and trying to work our way through that backlog of animals in the system. Hog slaughter is operating pretty much, it caught up to where it should be, well above year-ago levels and mostly in line with where we were expecting it to be this time of year pre-COVID. Let's say if we pretend COVID didn't happen, I would say hog slaughter is roughly where it needed to be. However, we still have a lot of pigs backed up in the system, and we're going to have a lot more coming in the next few months or so. So this is still going to prove a challenge moving forward in trying to work our way through that. One thing I'd like to point out as well, the result of holding these animals back longer as a result of the processing plants being closed is you're going to get heavier animals going in. So if you look at the average steer dress weight going in, that normally seasonally during May, June or so, you'd start to see a decline in the average weight. That never happened. So the resulting impact of this, and I'll show it in a little bit, is even though we have less animals being slaughtered, the fact that we have much heavier animals coming in means that we're getting more beef than we were a year ago, which sounds great, but you know, we're looking at a recession and we're looking at not excess production, but we're looking at pretty healthy levels of production. That doesn't bode well for beef prices necessarily, as well as the ultimate cattle prices that we see as well. You did not see quite the same impact weight-wise on hogs. I think some of that does go back to there was depopulation in the hog sector that you didn't really see in the cattle sector. Hogs, I'm sure talking to folks from this state, many of you would understand that they operate on much more of a just-in-time delivery system style. versus cattle. You can hold them a little bit longer on pasture, even on feed. Do your best to slow the rate of gain. You can do that in hogs too, but it's a lot harder, and it was a really difficult situation for hog producers throughout much of the early summer. It was really terrible for a lot of them there. But I mentioned we are looking at elevated beef production as well as elevated pork production. So we're producing more. Before COVID happened, 2020 was forecasted to be a record production year. Don't think we're going to necessarily hit that given the gap that we have for 3, 4, 5 weeks when we saw the slowdown in slaughter capacity, but we have gotten back on board pretty quick with that recovery, and we're producing more than we were a year ago. Again, the reason I point this out is the United States is in a recession, and it's very likely that we're going to have not have a V-shaped recovery necessarily, much more. Hopefully we do, but most people are betting on a slower, let's say Nike swoosh shaped recovery. And in recessions, animal proteins, in particular beef, historically does not perform very well. You think about it, it makes logical sense. Consumers are going to the grocery store, they have less money in their pocket because their hours are cut, they may have lost their job. And when people have less money, beef in particular is technically a luxury product in economic terms. So they're going to be looking for cheaper alternative proteins. So beef is going to struggle at the retail level moving forward. One thing we did also see during this pandemic is what was driving, and here I'll switch over, the cutout. So I talked about these two separate events, and you can see that in this graph. 2020 is the dark blue line, and it is, you think about that first bump, that's what I talked about, the demand event. Now that happening is all about people freaking out. You see pictures on social media of empty meat cases, and they're going out and clearing out store shelves. Things kind of started to recover. People were getting over it. And then we start to see the supply shock to the system, and that's that ridiculous spike that we see there. It has fallen, but it did not fall as quickly as it went up. We're starting to see a little bit of a recovery here in the last few weeks going into September. A little bit of that is seasonal, still well below our highs in March as well as May and June, and below the highs we saw in the Tyson fire and Holcomb, Kansas of last year, but still very, very strong beef cutout prices. What was, I use the term interesting, but what was curious whenever you saw the spikes occur, at least at the front end, what was driving the beef cutout was not typically what you tend to see. So usually your middle meats are incredibly valuable. You think beef tenderloin is typically one of the most expensive subprimals that you're going to get out of there. In terms of primals, your loins were not driving much of that rise. The biggest ones were your end meats. You think about it, it makes sense. People were emptying out grocery store shelves, and that's what was going into grocery stores. That's what you're using to make ground beef and things like that. That's heavily exposed to the retail sector. And we saw that resulting impact. It's a bit of an unusual situation in the meat business in terms of what was really valuable and what wasn't. You think about tenderloin dropped significantly. Think about steakhouses being closed. Not too many average Americans are going to go and grill themselves a filet mignon in their backyard. But with the prices where they were, they should have given that a shot. But the steakhouses being closed really switched up the way that Americans were, the way that the beef cutout was valued. We also saw somewhat of a similar reaction in the pork cutout. The reason I include 2014 on there is just to highlight the fact that people in the pork business, for beef, this was once in a lifetime. This has never happened before. In the pork business, they have seen these kind of cutout prices within recent history, just back into 2014. Now, granted, that was caused by the endemic diarrhea virus coming through and devastating much of the nation's herd. That was driving most of that, whereas this, you saw different price reactions. You saw the value of animals going down while you saw the value of the cutout going up. And that was frustrating for a lot of producers moving forward. So that leads us to what we can't get around talking about. A lot of our membership, a lot of folks in the countryside were very, very frustrated by this, and it makes a lot of sense, and it's perfectly understandable, is packer margins. So I want to be careful in talking about this, and that the graph I'm showing you is not actual packer margins. This is just something called the live to cutout spread. This is just the price of the outputs minus the price of the inputs. So your cutout and then byproduct values minus the cost of live steer, and then putting it on an equal basis. It is not including things like overhead. It's not including rent, electricity, processing costs like that. It's very importantly not including regulatory costs, which in running these plants and operating these plants, that's going to be a huge cost for them. And that's a big barrier to entry for a lot of smaller or medium-sized plants as well. It's gotten to the point where I had to zoom in on the right side just to get a better picture of where we are now relative to the last few years. This also doesn't tell the full story of people's reactions to COVID. So as these packing companies are spending more on PPE and trying to update their plants to cope with COVID-19, it's not showing any of their increased cost of dealing with that. It's not showing any increased cost of paying workers more to come in. A lot of these folks are running bonus structures, they didn't use the term hazard pay, but basically hazard pay, if you're able to come in and you don't miss any days of work, you get this kind of bonus. Most importantly, at least in my mind, it doesn't include the increased cost of running at reduced capacity. So one of the ways they operate at a certain level of capacity, they take that high fixed regulatory cost and they spread it out over a lot of different animals. So on a per head basis, you're able to reduce that down. If you're running at 60% capacity, that high fixed cost is spread out over a lot less animals. And as a result, don't get me wrong, packers were definitely making a lot of money during COVID, especially at those front times. But they weren't making quite what this graph tells you out to see. So I do want to make that distinction to make sure people understand that what this is and what this is not. Talk a little bit about some of the policy reactions. So whenever I put this together, I did not know that Chairman Peterson would cover everything that he covered. So he's already covered quite a bit of this, but we talked about a little bit of coronavirus food assistance program. So we had the CARES Act go through, and then the program that USDA put together is CFAP. And this is one where I know there's a lot of frustration, but at the same time, they put together a program very quickly. Congress wrote the bills and got them out the door very quickly. This is a lot to do, and I don't really necessarily envy them in trying to come up with these programs as quick as they did. And to their credit, they did do a lot of adjustment after the fact. They did allow organizations like Farm Bureau, other organizations around town to basically kind of raise your hand and say, hey, you left out some of these folks, and push for including additional stuff, particularly in the specialty crop stuff. But again, some stuff was left out that should not have been left out. We do agree, like the chairman said, and I know there was a question surrounding alfalfa there. So when we're talking about payment rates, just because of weird kind of legal methodology here, they made it just seems, and they make it more complicated than it actually is, but there's perfectly valid legal reasons for them doing it. So it depends on where their funding authority was coming from. So the blue lot, the kind of dark purple is the CCC payment rate, and the light blue-ish is the CARES payment rate. Really, you can just, for this one, average them together, and that's how you get your actual payment rate for each of these crops. What they charge it to is either the minimum of 50% of your 2019 production, or as of January 15th, what your inventory was at the time. So you take the payment rate and multiply it by that, and that would be a payment for the row crops, basically, non-specialty crops. Livestock was a bit more complicated. So you still have the CCC payment rate versus the CARES payment rate. There's a big discrepancy between them, but you can't just average these numbers. So for livestock, the CARES payment rate is applied to animals that were actually sold. So COVID hit, people who were still forced to sell animals during that situation would receive the CARES payment rate on a per head basis. So simply put, if you sold animals during that time, and let's say you're a feedlot, you sold fed cattle, you got $214 per animal. However, as the chairman hinted at, there were some cases where we were a little bit frustrated by the windows that they chose, the time windows. So it seemed a little bit arbitrary. So from January until this, I believe, mid-April, trying to remember, it's been a little while since these programs came out, you would get that payment rate. And then after that, you can pick a date in terms of inventory on your operation. So that $33 a head for any cattle, $17 for pigs, and then $7 for sheep, lamb is going to be based on inventory on your operation. So if you didn't sell your animals, you got a much lower payment rate, which I mean, that's something that a lot of our members flagged as an issue that we've raised with USDA. Should you really be penalizing producers who are exercising in their minds good judgment by not selling whenever you hit market lows? That's one where, you know, we've talked to USDA about it, but the cattle side of things and the hog side of things is a little bit more complicated than just the row crop side of things. He had mentioned that, you know, about half of that money still hasn't been spent. We did get an extension from USDA on the deadline to apply for stuff, so there is still time. If producers have not applied, they can still apply to it. So, and I'll point out, this is obviously a little bit dated. There's been more money sent out since then. Honestly, not that much, but you can see where across the country the majority of the spending has been, and that's, you know, places where it makes sense. Heavy ag states. In particular, most of the money, I think it's around half or so, has gone through livestock. So livestock states have gotten a pretty big chunk. And so you guys are included in that, I believe. And then you see it, cattle and hog states got a pretty decent amount of payment as well. However, I'll point out that payment rates have been slowing. So again, we put out, I think, a little bit more than half by now. These dates are a little bit dated. Specialty crops, even though they got a pretty big chunk of money basically allocated to it, they have not really been able to capture a lot of that funding. A lot of this, and for livestock, I'm surprised to see we have as much participation as we did, because livestock traditionally don't necessarily participate in Title I programs. They don't know who the person down at the FSA office is going to be to talk to necessarily. You kind of get that on the specialty crop side of things as well. We expected your row crop folks to be able to adapt pretty quickly because they know how this game goes, and they deal with this kind of paperwork and this stuff all the time. So specialty crop is one where it was really hard for a lot of producers out there. The chairman hinted at it, in that there were legitimate issues with pricing data, price discovery data on a lot of this. To USDA's credit, again, not all of them, and they may have missed out on some things, but for the most part, they did seem willing to work with folks, at least with organizations, and trying to point out that you may have left out some of the crops that people operate with. So they did seem open to, if you can do your best to show exactly how you may have been harmed specifically by COVID, then they might be willing to work with some of the stuff. So they again, to their credit, they did, after the fact, add quite a few more crops to the list who were eligible for payments under CFAP. With that, I don't think I need to talk too much about what's next, because you have the man who's actually in DC on the committee, in charge of the committee, who's in the conversations, and quite frankly, I'm not. So I think he's covered what's going to be coming down the pipeline and any kind of timelines we have moving forward. With that, Karen, happy to turn it over to any kind of questions. Trying to keep everybody within the allotted time so I can get you out of here on time.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. And again, if anyone has any questions, please enter them into the chat or the Q&A. With that, Michael, we did have one question about if you're willing to share your slide deck with folks on this call. And he says yes. So
Absolutely.
we will make that available to folks that would like to see that. I'm always so impressed with American Farm Bureau's information, how it's presented, how clean it is and easy to read. You know, I think, and hopefully some questions will roll in, but I know we do have some folks from the livestock sectors involved on this call. And you mentioned it when you talked about the timeline, but I think that's the biggest sticking point that we're hearing from producers is when you look at those charts, it was really beyond that April 15th date when the biggest hits were incurred from many of those producers. And so whether that's using existing funds, and I see that Chairman Peterson, someone is still at least listening, so maybe this can be echoed again, but using those additional dollars, or the dollars that have already been allocated, to just extend the timeline. I know we needed to have an end date in order to have a program and to get those dollars flowing into the system, but that definitely seems to be a major concern because some of those largest discrepancies really happened beyond that timeline. So that would be something I think, however we can continue to monitor that issue and hearing from producers and examples from farmers and ranchers as to how that's impacting them when they went to go sell after that date would be also very helpful for us.
And I would just echo that. These kind of examples are really helpful when not only communicating with the Hill, but with communicating with folks over at USDA. It really goes a long way to be able to share actual experiences of our membership. And in terms of the slides, happy to share. My only caveat is recognizing that, a few of these slides are a little bit out of date. They're a few weeks old. It's a lot of effort to update all the data. But I do understand it's throwing a lot of numbers and a lot of charts and graphs at you, so it's helpful to be able to look at them after the fact.
And I also think you talked about kind of the food supply system and how meat trickled through in different channels and ended up somewhere different. And I think that's been a really interesting opportunity for all of us on the production side to learn about the food chain and the supplies and how food really does have a huge path beyond the farm gate. And when that path gets altered, they can have all sorts of trickle down effects. So thank you for bringing that to light and watching kind of the retail and the food service sector and how they've responded or changed course has been really fascinating. All right, so we do have a question here. I figured something like this would come up. So packer margins always seem to adjust when investigations start. Any chance of more packer oversight? As you mentioned, it kind of showed in those slides, things kind of came back in line a little bit about the time that the investigation was maybe happening. So any thoughts on the packer investigation and oversight from governmental regulators?
Yeah, so I will, I guess, start with the fact that investigation still is currently ongoing. I know USDA, AMS, with the help of the Office of the Chief Economist, I'm sure many people know, but for those of you who don't, whenever the chairman would mention Rob Johansson, he's the chief economist over at USDA, and his shop helped put together a lot of the programs. But on the packer investigation side, the investigation is still ongoing from the Packers and Stockyards Division, which used to be GIPSA, its own independent division, but it was moved under AMS. Now, the report that they released was largely kind of an economic analysis of what had happened, as well as putting out some potential policy suggestions, so not necessarily the results of the investigation. So I do want to be clear that whenever they released that report, they did come out and say that investigation is ongoing and they can't release all the information that they currently are working with. I think in terms of your question, at the end of the day, I think there's too much attention on them, on the issue right now, not to have some increased oversight moving forward. You saw the letter that came from all the different state attorneys generals pushing the administration to move. So they actually talked about having the Department of Justice open up more of a criminal investigation into it. And then there's multiple investigations. There's also the the CFTC has been conducting their own investigations into what was going on the futures and options markets and all of this. So I do think we've already seen increased oversight at the very least looking into this moving forward. I think it also depends on how we move forward with any kind of legislation outside of this. So that, again, the AMS report did have some potential proposed solutions moving forward that, AFBF is, we don't necessarily have policy on it yet, and we don't know if it's something that we're going to get behind or work towards, but some of the potential solutions that the report mentioned were giving the secretary more authority to be able to enforce and go after this kind of behavior. Again, not saying that we necessarily believe that there was wrongdoing, but making sure that the secretary is equipped with the adequate tools to be able to move forward on stuff like that. So I have a hard time believing that there won't be at least a spotlight shown on this and more oversight that way. I don't necessarily think that means you're going to get any kind of indictments, fines, all that stuff, but they're definitely going to be watched far more closely.
Well, thank you, Michael, for responding to that question. And thank you so much for your presentation today. We want to kind of turn it over and highlight Minnesota Farm Bureau as a very strong membership organization. And part of that effort is kind of highlighting some of our staff members who work really hard for the organization. And one of them today is Amanda Revere, who is our membership and marketing specialist out of the Southwest area. And Amanda, welcome to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. What a great, with Chairman Peterson and then with the information from American Farm Bureau today. And behind me, you can see what they call the big wheel or the giant Ferris wheel. Today, the Minnesota State Fair would have been opening day at the Minnesota State Fair. And one thing to highlight there, as you all know, Minnesota Farm Bureau has a booth there. And if you check us out on the social media, Facebook, Instagram, all of those good things, just as you maybe had watched and participated today on our Shop Talk, we are doing a book giveaway each day of the Minnesota State Fair. So just because we're not there in person, we are still trying to have some fun. So be sure and check out our Facebook page, share it, comment, try and win a book, but definitely share it with those that, if you're like me, I have a lot of egg books in my library already. So share that. But a couple other things just to highlight, definitely check out fbmn.org. So Minnesota Farm Bureau's webpage, we have lots of information about our member benefits. One of them being today, as you partook in Shop Talk. It was also open. If you're not currently a member, please feel free to join. Like you saw today, Shop Talk was one of the great member benefits, but we have several others that not only relate to public policy and Farm Bureau being at the table when you cannot because you're busy with your business or you're out in the field. I know a lot of silage chopping has started taking place out there. So Farm Bureau's at the table when you're not, but some of those other great member benefits such as insurance, hotels, and such as Office Depot and John Deere and a vehicle benefit. So check it all out, and I really appreciate everyone's time today.
Thank you so much, Amanda. In addition, another thing we wanted to highlight today, because it actually is happening this evening on RFD TV, we have American Farm Bureau as part of a special that will be airing on mental health, rural mental health issues. And if anyone has RFD TV, it's also on Sirius Radio, some other channels. So we will be sharing that on our Facebook page. So hopefully you will be able to connect and watch that this evening. So in addition, we have one more week of Shop Talk that we're really excited about, which is of this series. We're hoping that this maybe continues onward, but this series will be wrapping up next Thursday, September 3rd. And we got really a fun one and a very localized one where we will have MDA Commissioner Tom Peterson as our main presenter. And we are really excited to have our special guest, Governor Tim Walz, joining us. Same time, noon on Thursday, September 3rd. And hopefully you'll all join us and share the information with your friends. Hopefully you have a great rest of the day and have a great Thursday. Bye.